you the testimony on Raise the Age. And Zach had a question. Over to you, Zach.
Thank you very much, Martin. And thank you all for the testimony. I really appreciate you being here. I know that you guys are frequent flyers at this point, so it's nice to see you all. And that actually was not pun intended. Following up on the plain testimony from earlier. So from what I'm hearing from all of you and throughout your testimony, I've really seen this theme of and concern, a shared concern of accountability weave throughout all of your testimony. I hope that's fair to say. And I think there's also this shared realization from all of you on screen and those of us here in the room that we're in a very precarious situation here in the state of Vermont insofar as it relates to public safety. So my question for you is that, do you feel, is it safe to say that I'm understanding your testimony correct in the sense that raising the age here in the state of Vermont to 19 would not only make a precarious situation worse, but it could potentially be reckless on behalf of legislators? And that can go to any and all. I would be curious to hear all of your opinions on it.
Nobody's taking the bait.
No. This is Tyler Allen. I'll venture to say I would be hesitant to use the word reckless, given the fact that there has been a great deal of deliberation and positive intention in this, and we recognize that the ground beneath our feet is shifting. And so I don't think I would kind of categorize it as reckless decision making so much as being kind of self-aware of where we're at as a state and what the capacity we have to do good work for the youth we serve. And
Tyler, I appreciate that. And I certainly don't mean to question intent, but I do question whether the system in place, and this goes to your testimony, Nikki, as well. And I can tell that your team is doing everything they can to be as diligent as possible with the caseload that you have. But I think, again, I guess this would go to you directly, Nikki, do you think that your team is prepared for what could be a very overwhelming situation when you do not have the resources to handle this potential influx of cases?
I think that while my team would be prepared to do the best work that they could, I just don't think that it would set the youth up to be as successful as they could be, because they wouldn't have access to the supports that they need to ultimately, do what we're hoping that they'll do, which is to engage in the services offered to them to reduce their recidivism and allow them to achieve their goals of not having further systems involvement, whether it's DCF or Department of Corrections or something later down the line. And so, I think that it would not allow for them to have access to the things that they would need in the ways that they could if the caseload and the capacity was different for the workers serving them.
Right. And I don't think. Oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
And I don't think for me, I think there's capacity, but really what I think about, and I think it's also helpful that I've had the experience of working with the youthful offender population. That was the caseload that I primarily held for the longest time as a worker. And I think that really what my observations is the lack of accountability for youth to engage in those things to ultimately have them be in a better position is lacking in the juvenile delinquency docket. And it is present, I believe, more so in the youthful offender docket.
Sure. And I think, I guess to take it a step further too, how could you possibly be as hands-on as you and your team would like, with an influx of cases, right? It's just simply not prudent for us to consider additional strain on the system at this point, right?
Yeah, and I do think, I know one of the questions has been like, what is the day in the life of a caseworker? And so, I think all of my workers, set out to really be able to be present with the youth on their caseload when they do have their meetings, and that fluctuates from, at least one monthly face-to-face contact. I think a lot, especially for the youth that we're really trying to get on the right foot, that most workers would typically really try to do every other week if possible, to really just make sure that they're engaging in the services. That gets really hard to do when you might have a youth that's in custody that needs new placement to be identified. And that obviously rises to a higher level of need because, we're also charged with ensuring child safety, and we need to find a place for that kid to lay their head at night. And so you might be rescheduling your best intentioned appointment with the over 18-year-old that you were going to bring them to therapy because they were struggling to find rides to therapy.
Yeah.
You might have to kind of pivot those things too.
Yeah, I think safety of the offenders is another crucial component of all this. And I guess one final follow-up to Erica. Erica, do you share the concern of many others about recidivism with the youthful offenders?
Yes, absolutely. And I want to I agree with Tyler and Nikki in terms of reckless sort of, makes me feel, I don't know.
My words, not yours. Yeah, my words,
But
not
in
yours.
terms of not setting the kiddos up on the best path forward, I think that's the problem. And for those that are in the work, if we don't want to be a part of the harm. So that's where I am with that. But in terms of recidivism, yeah, I mean, if we don't have the program supports and services in place, then I think that, and with that lack of accountability, I think that it's just a natural outgrowth of that could be recidivism. And really, the whole point of Raise the Age is to try to make sure we get youth as when they're young, to try to keep them out of that criminal justice system as best we can. And we don't ever want to end up doing something to even make that path faster.
That's right. Thank you very much.
Karen, Tom, and Angela.
Yes. So mine has to do with the youthful offender piece, and I'm bringing it up because it also came in our previous witness as well. Just talked about how youthful offenders available for a lot of these instances already, and so why can't we just use that? And when we got our overview last week of this, my note on youthful offender was high risk, high reward. And so I feel like it's important it's not exactly the same as having somebody go through the system and have the alternative to go to criminal court. That my understanding is that if somebody goes into the youthful offender, they have the opportunity to stay out of criminal, but if something goes wrong, they automatically go into the sentencing phase in criminal court. And so I just feel like that's an important difference and probably sets people up for different futures and paths. Is that right? I just want to make sure, because I'm hearing that as an alternative, and I want to confirm they really are two different paths, though.
Yes, they are two different paths. So you're right. I mean, I would say when you talk about high risk, high reward, oftentimes when we originally had youthful offender, and the status has been around for many, many years. This didn't start with this initiative. We expanded it through this initiative. But typically what we would see is higher risk cases would get youthful offender status. You have two agencies providing supervision. And so again, we really want to be responsive to youth's needs. We don't want to create more risk where there isn't the risk by over serving a youth. That said, what we've seen with the expansion is that anybody right now, because we've raised the age to 18, anybody from age 19 up until their 22nd birthday for any charge is eligible for youthful offender consideration. So even though we typically saw this as a status that benefited the higher risk youth, all of those youth do get, or can get, I should say, youthful offender status. A lot of them do. And so although we may not be serving these youth as Raise the Age youth as we're looking at and talking about right now, they would certainly potentially come to us as a youthful offender case. And so it's not that they would be entirely shut out from the family division or the family court system. They would have a different status. And you're right, the level of accountability is different because there is the option for the family court to revoke the youthful offender status and for that case to be returned to the criminal division. So jurisdiction would not end. They can't time out the same way that a delinquency case can. So that's the significant difference. That gap is filled with the youthful offender cases.
Okay. And it seems like the outcome is very different too, because if it does get revoked and goes back, it goes automatically to sentencing rather than starting in the process. So It seems like that's an important piece that wouldn't come and raise the age for that individual.
Exactly. For raise the age, their jurisdiction ends and there's no systems recourse for that if there's not engagement.
Well, yeah, thank you. I keep hearing about resources and I'm gonna assume that a big percentage of resources is code for workforce. And with that, I guess, and I think the question might be for Nikki or maybe Erica. As far as workload goes for that say social workers have, and with this population, what's the optimal number of clients for a worker, and how many do you have?
That's a great question. I spoke a little bit in my testimony about kind of what the workload looks like for my workers in Burlington. And like I said, we do have 5 workers. One of those workers is newer, so they do not have as high of a caseload as some of the other workers. I also have a couple of cases on my own. Typically, our central office counts non-custody JJ cases as kind of half. That would be counted towards like CPS cases. Optimal numbers for CPS cases are 16 to 15 families. What I will say, both in CPS as well as, the JS caseloads, the needs of youth and families have looked very different. So those numbers, I think, would feel outdated due to lack of resources. Workers are tasked with making sure that kiddos get from placement to school every day, which has resulted in workers needing to transport at least, I think, typically have like one before work hours transport on their caseload and need to find other ways to get youth to school or to their placement after school. So just really like supporting basic needs of children and families. With my workers having 25 roughly cases each, that is above, I think, what or close to above what would be optimal. And again, given any given day, if a youth is really struggling, we have to be responsive to that. And so that really shifts the workload as well. And sometimes that it takes a while to stabilize a youth that might be struggling. So that could be an increased workload for multiple days and weeks in a row.
Sure. And if you had a bigger workforce, of course, an individual's workload is going to be less, of course. So with the three youth you talked about earlier that I believe you said timed out, I think in the Burlington area, if you had a workforce that was at a level that everybody had a reasonable amount of work, and I know it's just a guess, but what would be the chances of those 3 youth getting a little more oversight or care, whatever word you want to use to describe it, and to improve their chances of fulfilling their obligations, I guess, and not just timing out and then being thrown back out into the world?
I think for those youth specifically, it was really more so about their willingness to engage in the process. I do think that those youth had experiences within our system where the staff really leaned in and tried to offer opportunities to support them, but they were just not in a position to be able to do that and did wait for their cases to time out.
Okay, so they knew how the system worked. And one more question, we've heard, a couple of people say and make comments about hiring people for DCF to deal with this population. I'm certainly not pointing any fingers, but why is DCF having problems hiring and keeping people to service this population?
Oh, that's a great question. And, it is just in the agency of human services and human services work nationwide, there is a, a difficulty with retaining social workers. Our vacancy rate right now is on par with, I believe, New Hampshire, but it is higher than, I believe, Maine. So even in our New England uh, cohort here, we're better than some, worse than others, but definitely there are other states that are suffering much more. But one of the things that we're really trying to do is dig in with retention. So in terms of having we're trying to hire a wellness coordinator, somebody to really come in and address what our workers need in terms of, stability, resilience, and really making sure that they are being satisfied with the work that they're doing. We're also having a mentorship pilot because one of the things we understand is that our workers really want to make sure they're doing the work well and pairing them up with a seasoned social worker. And a lot of this is coming from us hiring a workforce development director that's really dedicated to doing this work. And she's been on the job a year. And another thing that she has started is stay interviews so that we can try to really figure out what keeps people coming and what we can do to encourage our best workers to continue staying with us. And then on the other end, in terms of recruitment, we've started to make connections with colleges to talk about what we do as family services workers to get new people in the door. But it is a challenge. It's not easy.
And just one more question. So since COVID, I mean, every industry and doesn't matter what job we're talking about or trade or anything, people have been entities, I guess, have had trouble filling spaces as far as the workforce goes. And so with DCF, was there issues before COVID as far as keeping the number of as far as keeping the workforce up to where it should be?
I was not here before COVID, so I might defer to my colleagues, but I believe there's always been uh, a worker gap, but it's now far worse than it had been in the past. And one of our issues is not even when it takes a long time to get new workers in, and then you're still having some people leave. So then there's that gap that although you're getting new folks, because there aren't other people right there working, it really does create more of a tense environment for the workers that are there. But I'm going to, Lindy, Tyler, I know you were there beforehand. I'd love for you to weigh in.
If I could weigh in really quickly on that, I think the other part, Representative, you acknowledged kind of astutely that workforce is kind of what we're talking about when we say resources, but the other half of that equation really is service provision. So DCF, our workers are whether be they probation officer or just fulfilling a standard kind of Chin's casework. We are putting in time and attention and energy to it. And I do think a national standard is somewhere around, a national best practice is more akin to like 12 cases. So that is part of the work, but the other part of it is we are providing services. So we have contracted services, we work with community partners, we work with residential programs and group homes. Nikki spoke earlier about needing to make sure that we have beds for people to lay their heads on at times. And I think that's the other place where we've seen huge reduction. That reduction in our kind of residential workforce, our contracted residential workforce, that has been on national decline well before COVID. COVID kind of dramatically accelerated that rate. And then the aftermath of COVID has been that those types of jobs that are direct and in person in those settings are harder and harder to fill as we increase our virtual environment and so on and so forth. So part of it is the workforce directly. The other part of it is, are we having access to the services to put in place? And one of the things that we've seen is because all of our I'll just speak to our residential service providers. They have less capacity than they did before because of reduced staffing. They are often becoming more, they're defining what populations they can serve more narrowly. So specifically youth that have an aggressive profile attached to their needs are virtually impossible to find placements for. And so a lot of energy then has to happen that our caseworkers are trying to pour in more energy to getting more referrals out, to finding more programs, and having to try to work with that population. So that's kind of how these things crash in together. This is not raise the age specific, but it's been so much a part of our conversation over the years of how the high-end system of care impacts our capacity to meet the need. And I think the last point I'd like to make people aware of is we're seeing 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds. We're more likely to see young people that are in a stage of life that they might not be in an educational setting anymore. They might not be in high school anymore. They might not be in their homes with parents or have as many familial connections in their life because they're entering kind of in a normative way into a more transitional part of their life. But if they're also interacting with these systems, there are less stabilizing factors for us to work with. And so that's a big part of DCF's approach, whether we're on the probation side of the equation or the child safety side of the equation, we're trying to work holistically with the kids we're working with. And if there's less stable factors in their life, it increases the demand. And so I think when we start contemplating older youth and what the needs are, housing becomes a much bigger, more prescient issue. And obviously housing is well outside of just a DCF conversation or a family services division conversation.
Yeah, I know
Thank
that
you.
that was one of the things that in our staff survey, that was one of the differences. Erica spoke a little bit about this when she was talking about what worked with the 18-year-olds. That was one of the areas that staff started to see a stark difference between 18-year-olds and the 19-year-olds was those stabilizing factors in their life were gone. And so they were trying to make it out on their own, and they may not have had the support of a caretaker, a family, school or employment. And those are really factors that were causing issues for the youth and being able to engage in their probation conditions.
Yeah, thank you.
So
Thank you.
before I go to Angela and Tom, other Tom, and before I forget, if one of you could submit to Nate the reports that were submitted to the Joint Justice Oversight, because there are a lot of details in those reports as far as the efforts of DCF to fill the workforce. I think that would be valuable to have before the committee. So if one of you could take that on. Angela, and then Tom.
Okay, thank you. So Lindy, what you just said is a perfect segue to my question, really, because I'm sitting here thinking that thinking about the fact that it's very clear to me that everyone at DCF has a true commitment to doing what's best for kids and doing what's right, even for the individuals, each kid, each young person that they work with. So that's a shared value, a shared goal, I think, of DCF and the folks in this room, I hope, of the legislature. That being true, how would you have us think about a repeal of Raise the Age, knowing what we know about brain science and Lindy, what you just said about these 19-year-old kids who have higher needs and fewer supports? How can we say they're better off in the criminal justice process? How can I even like really consider that a viable, good choice, knowing what we know and that we're, that's what I'm struggling with.
I think that the focus should be on what supports and services, what we can build out on that works, knowing that with Raise the Age coming in for 18-year-olds, we're not seeing that with that lack of accountability, that it would be effective. So I think it would be leaning into what can be done based on what we know is effective. And Lindy, I'd look to you to provide an opinion as well.
Certainly, Erica. And when you speak about the criminal justice system, there are alternatives in that system for like fine-only dispositions for some of the lower level charges. There's still the youthful offender route for youth. Again, reminding the committee that there's the opportunity for state's attorneys to file those directly as youthful offender petitions. So that would eliminate any filing in criminal division, and that is a choice that the state's attorney has. So that would eliminate the kind of further eliminate the collateral consequences, because the filing would not happen in criminal division if they chose that route. So they're all.
Which is a big if in some counties.
I didn't hear that. Sorry, what?
It's just, that's a big if in some counties.
Yeah, the decisions to the state's attorney, you're correct.
Yes.
As I mentioned, we have other alternatives that we've built within the system. We're not able to enforce those. We could look at those opportunities maybe as alternatives in the criminal justice system, similar to what we did in the juvenile justice system. But there are other alternatives. There's deferred sentences, and I know DOC has spoken to that in the past when asked this question related to raise the age. So there are other alternatives, is what I would say. I can tell you that the chair mentioned the data. I need to sneak in the data. So at 1.2, this is the third time that I've presented to the committee this year. And the first time we were meeting about the raise the age report, there was a question related to, or comment related to the 19-year-olds. So should raise the age move forward on April 1st? There are currently 152 cases. If they do not have resolution by that time, that would transfer automatically on that date of the family division. I worked with Judge Zone in the Judiciary on getting this information. So 55 of those cases are non-Big 11 felony cases, and 97 of those are misdemeanors. So unless there's resolution, 152 cases will come to family division if raise the age goes through. And I have other caseload data that I can share that I provided to the committee, but it will be in our next raise the age report, which will be filed at the end of the month. So if there's not time to review it today, the committee does have it.
Right. Any other data, or can I go to Tom for a question?
Mine might take data.
Is that? Over to Tom.
You're starting to go down the direction I was looking to go at, my cohort here. I'm thinking the same thing. I only maybe from a different angle. If someone is, I'll use the term recycled back to criminal court from youthful offender status, I'm assuming the crimes are obviously lesser. They're not part of the big 11 or 14 or whatever we've got going on now. But if they're recycled back to criminal court, the resolution is most likely, judging from the numbers, not going to be a punitive sentence of any sort. We're looking at a probative sentence or a financial type of thing, or work crew would be great if we had that maybe. What does your experience tell you about someone going from youthful offender status in potentially a punitive situation? Slim to none?
I'm not sure what happens with those cases, to be honest with you, because we're not a party at that point. The family division case is closed. As I mentioned earlier, the majority of the youthful offender cases, I would say, are higher risk cases. So I would not assume that they're not big 11 cases. We have youthful offenders that we work with that have several aggravated assaults, sexual assaults, attempted murder. I know Nikki's worked with a case for attempted murder. We have murder charges that come our way. Whether or not they have YO resolution, not all of them do, but a large portion of these cases are higher risk cases. So I know that in some situations, that is a part of the consideration in the family division when they're looking at whether or not revocation is appropriate. We've had judges cite the fact that this youth may go to jail for 25 years when they're talking about their sentence. So that is something that I think comes into play in the family division for sure. But I don't have that data. I'm not sure if that is something that the criminal division might track as a return. I'm not exactly sure.
Currently, most of the ones you're getting ready to, if you have to go back April 1st, are misdemeanors, though, correct?
97 of those are misdemeanors and 55 are non-big 11 felonies.
Okay.
So
And we have that document online, so. No. All right, so I have a question. So, what idea, or just looking at because 18-year-olds are already there, and as far as I understand, I think the administration's position is to not go to 19. But with 18-year-olds, what are your suggestions of being able to have more accountability? And if you don't have any right now, how about some by the end of the week or soon? Some suggestions. I mean, how can we get more accountability for the 18-year-olds? And if you have suggestions now, I'll take.
I think that we're still working on those, so I have to defer right now, and I see what our commissioner is thinking in terms of what we're able to talk about.
Fair enough. I understand that. So the other related question is that if we take care of accountability, if we're able to put something in here for 18 and 19-year-olds for that matter, does that affect the consideration as far as proceeding? How big of a factor do you still have with respect to resources? Because I heard they're kind of intermingled. I mean, if you had better accountability, the resources you may not need unless I misunderstood that testimony. At least that's what I was gathering from it, that they're kind of interrelated. So I guess the question, I mean, if we are able to address the accountability, where do we stand as far as resource needs?
I think that Nikki addressed it well in that they would be able to work with it, but I do think we would still need additional resources. I know that we were talking about at a certain time, we would need additional assistance from Barge. I'm wondering, Lindy, if you could sort of spell that out.
Sure. Part of what we've been exploring or would have proposed is the ability to take the delinquent youth not in our legal custody off our caseloads and transfer the supervision of those cases to Barge, which is our Balanced and Restorative Justice Partners. We have a contract with them in each of our 12 districts. We would not, at this point, we would still remain involved with the cases because we're the conduit to court, unless we did make some legislative changes around supervision. But at least initially, the hope would be that they could take on those cases across the state. Right now, they currently do not have the capacity to do that with their current staffing. There was recently some increases in their funding, but we hadn't been able to provide an increase in their funding for about 15 years. So it wasn't really an increase. It was just trying to bring them up to where they should have been many years ago. They're still not where they need to be to meet the current need in each community, but without additional funding of at least one provider or one additional police manager in each program, we would not be able to make that shift universally from our caseload to theirs.
Appreciate that. So any other questions? I guess one last thing is on the accountability issue, if there are some ideas on that, we'll probably be taking this issue up again in early February, and that gives a little time to consider or look into that issue a little bit further. So thank you very much for your testimony. I really appreciate all the time you spent with us this afternoon. It was very helpful. And we are going to move on to Matthew Bernstein and Lauren Higby from the Office of Child, Youth, and Family Advocate. And I'm going to, before you jump into the, please.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again. Thank you again. Before you jump into your presentation, I'm going to jump right with the question initially, and then we go. And that is, why isn't youthful offender sufficient to address individuals of this age, including up to 22, that we have this path now for individuals to go into the delinquency or into family court with all its benefits of confidentiality? Why is that not sufficient to address the concerns that we have for youthful or for juveniles, really?
I'll identify myself for the record first.
Yes, after-
I would like some clarification on your question.
Yes.
So I'm Matthew Bernstein, the Child, Youth, and Family Advocate for the state of Vermont, and with me is.
Everyone, Lauren Higbee, Deputy Advocate with OCY.
And welcome back, by the way.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really not trying to stall on your question. May I correct the record on something I testified on Friday, for just very, very briefly, because I know this was in response to a question that Representative Goodnow had, saying your name correctly.
Good now, yes.
Goodnow, okay. And I wanted to share my screen very, very briefly, I promise, and then just correct the record here. So hopefully, let's see, slideshow here. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes. Yes.
So if I, okay, my bad. Of course, now I can't see the thing I wanted to read. Anyway, so to correct the record, this was a chart I put up on Friday. This is in reference to raising the minimum age of delinquency jurisdiction for essentially 10 and 11-year-olds. And the question was whether these were dockets or charges. And I believe I said they were dockets, and I was incorrect. I went back and got clarification, and these are individual charges. So there's actually fewer dockets than I previously thought. So that was the full clarification of my apologies, and thank you for the question. Okay, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing now and then share our other slide in a second. But would you mind repeating your question, Chair
Well, I
Lilly?
think we've heard that we shouldn't be as concerned about this age group 19 or 20 or 21-year-olds because there's another path to get into the juvenile court, into family court, and that's by way of youthful offender.
Okay.
Why isn't that enough?
And you say you shouldn't be concerned, and why isn't that enough? Meaning what? Meaning what?
Address the youth that or the juveniles that we want to have a different path where it's confidential, where we're trying to keep them out of the criminal justice system.
In other words, why shouldn't we repeal the 19-year-old part of raise the age because we can rely on the youthful offender? Is that kind of okay? So I think the answer is, the youthful offender statute ultimately relies, the accountability piece is a very, it's a big stick, right? We're saying here, I mean, I think your question takes into account, there's too much carrot, not enough stick here, right? We need more stick. That's too big of a stick in many instances to have the threat of adult charges hanging over a low-level offense. There was a question earlier about, I think from you, Representative, about the punitability, that's not a word, the punitiveness of when I think this, correct me if I'm wrong, but when a youthful offender charge is sent to the criminal court, how punitive is it? Is that?
Well, when I say punitive, I mean jail.
Right.
Thank you.
So I think, I don't, full expert on this either, but I will say, like, there's one youth that we're working with who's in DCF custody, who has 2 felonies, who's on the youthful offender docket, and, has had a lot of ups and downs. And in fact, DCF just did refer him to the criminal court for a violation of his probation on those 2 felonies. I don't know what the exact charges could be, but it could be, I guess, punitive in the sense of incarceration. Absolutely. And, he's an interesting example. He's going to be 18 in just a couple of months. And, I don't think you could look at him and say there's a lack of accountability. I think you might look at him and say, why does this kid keep messing up, even though he knows what the consequences are, right? And that maybe is a segue. I don't know. I think I've answered your question, but that is a segue to why, or it's a return to the question, I guess, of why race is important. Because for a young person like him, even though he does have the threat of jail hanging over his head, he keeps re-engaging in behavior that, honestly is metaphorically, sort of shooting himself in the foot. Like, he's really tripping himself up. And the problem is not he doesn't have the right hook or stick or something over him. The problem is his brain cannot look at the long-term consequences of his actions and he can't successfully take that and leverage that into his behavior today, right? And he cannot delay the gratification and the dopamine hit of engaging in allegedly criminal behavior. So I think that's really the answer to your question, is that, simply, accountability has many elements to it. And, over criminalizing youth isn't really accountability. It's wanting to solve these very real problems that are actually on our first slide. But it doesn't, when you're dealing with a brain that is not fully developed, like all youth that age, you're not effectively deterring that crime by simply putting them in jail. And in fact, what you're doing is, and this is on some previous slides, often what you're doing is lumping that youth in, you're sort of reifying what they're reading on the, or maybe that's too fancy of a word. You're confirming what they're seeing on the internet, on these TikTok videos about how to steal cars, or whatever. This sort of tough mentality. You're putting them in an institution sometimes with others similar to that. And what we know from the brain science is that youth offend in groups, right? They egg each other on, they meet each other in facilities often, and then they often allegedly reoffend with those groups of people. So often it is counterproductive to do that. And when you're dealing with a low-level charge, especially for high-level charges, I'm not here to say people, shouldn't have pressures on them to behave, whether they like it or not. But for low-level charges, that's not what you want. That's not what the science says. And I'd like to get to that study we talked about earlier, but someone had a question.
Zach has a question, and I want to circle back. I have a question.
Sorry, I'm listening. I'm just.
Yeah, so thank you, Chair. So I understand that the anecdote, right, of this young individual who was after a dopamine hit to steal cars. I guess, how do you?
Not to say that he was stealing cars, but
well, whatever.
Allegedly,
whatever it might have been.
I'm not even alleged.
Excuse me. I think after some kind of dopamine hit.
Yes.
How do you distinguish between brain science and someone who's morally corrupt, and that is a danger to society? I guess if we swept everything under the rug as brain science and kids that are after a dopamine hit, then we wouldn't have any accountability in the system.
I guess I'd ask you, what is morally?
But I'm asking you the question.
Okay.
But my question is, I just don't understand how we distinguish. It seems like brain science would be an easy scapegoat for any kind of crime.
I mean,
versus someone who is, and whether you call it a morally corrupt or whatever it might be, but someone who is bad intentioned is going to commit these crimes, whether they're after a dopamine hit or not.
Sorry, I cannot figure out how to share my screen correctly. I apologize. I guess I would say, I'm not quite sure what morally corrupt means. I mean, I think,
someone who's bad intentioned. There are evil people in the world. Would you agree with that?
Sure.
Okay. I don't think I think that's a pretty yes or no question. I think it's pretty binary. That there are bad people. There are bad actors in society.
Sure. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not quite sure to answer your question. I guess I think one of our jobs is the way we treat our young people is ensuring that to use your terminology, ensuring that they don't become morally corrupt or bad people, right? And so to go back to the question, again, for a low-level charge, you're trying to keep them from getting drawn into a criminal system, for lack of a better word. Right. So, if you want to try to identify kids at 18 and 19, who's a bad person and who's not a bad person, I think you're going to make a lot of mistakes, not you, but one is going to make a lot of mistakes. Right. And I think that, the brain science part to bring it in is again, recognizing that most young people make a lot of mistakes. If you think about yourself at that age, I'm not asking you to share, but if we all think about ourselves at that age and the things that we did, we engaged in a lot of behavior that was risky, and that at the time, was a dopamine hit, was something that we didn't fully recognize the consequences of. I can speak for myself. I certainly engaged in that kind of behavior, and most of these kids in these systems are poor youth. There are a lot of kids who have been in the foster care system who have been raised by the state, and so to make that judgment at that time, I think would be a huge mistake. They've suffered trauma, and which also impacts the way your brain develops, and and so that's what I see raise the age, and not just me, but that's what this extensive raise the age implementation report that I would like to point us all back to from 2019. It's all in there, right? So that's, I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's.
Not really.
Okay, well,
We'll move on.
I'm willing to,
Can I try?
I'm happy to, yeah. I'm happy
while I
to-
try to figure out how to share my screen.
Okay. I appreciate that question because I think it's also getting at like the public safety aspect and that perspective. I would maybe frame it in that we're trying to keep it at brain science, right? I'm really trying to isolate and understand what caused those problematic behaviors and then respond accordingly. So in my mind, raise the age is prevention for those youth, right? And that it's really addressing them not becoming morally corrupt. Because we're at a critical point where we actually can change their minds. We can actually support them to change that behavior. And so what we're trying to do is enact raise the age, keep the 19-year-olds coming on in what, April? Because we're going to see better outcomes in health for our young people. We're going to see higher educational achievements. We're also going to see better employment rates. We have a workforce shortage. We have to get our young people into the workforce. And this is just one way for us to do that.
I appreciate that. And I think that the only issue that I take, and then not to go too far down the rabbit hole, Chair, but I think I just want to make this last point, is that the premise that all of these youthful offenders that you're interacting with are principally able to be saved and inherently good is false.
Oh, no.
Right. So, well, no, I think that's unfortunately, no, but unfortunately, I think it's just a very harsh reality that we have to come to is that while I hope, and I think the majority of these youths come from very difficult circumstances and have dealt with the trauma that you've referenced, and certainly are people that we want to bring into the system to help take care of and set them up for success, there is a minority of those people who are not well-intentioned or good actors. And I think that's just a really unfortunate reality that we have to come to, that these are not only going to be repeat offenders. We look at the recidivism statistics that, which has been a huge concern to this committee all day and last week. So it's something that we keep hearing testimony about and the concerns around recidivism. But I think it is a reality, and this is where I'm going to leave it, is that while the majority, I hope, can be saved and helped with great people like yourselves, there is a small proportion of those individuals that are going to be a huge detriment to society and perhaps should face the consequences of their actions in the criminal justice system.
So I would say those people that you're talking about who I'm sure, are committing serious crimes, right? Those are not raise the age youth. And if you want to say because they've touched the justice system once or twice early on, and then later on they do something serious, like, there's a lot of efforts to predict criminal behavior. And, most of those that are successful are, in movies, right? That are like science, like no one's been able to do that successfully, right? Even with brain scans, et cetera.
Which is why I raise issue with brain science and technology, right? Like, I think, again, I don't want to keep going down the rabbit hole, Chair, but I think
this is important conversation. I appreciate the questions.
So, but I would just say, like, those are not raised. I think, like, part of the problem with this whole conversation that's frustrating
that these individuals are committing that are privy to raise the age.
And so that would get to being, I mean, like, one thing that is true that I think is under acknowledged it was under acknowledged today is for somebody who commits a serious felony, whether big 11+3 or whether a felony that is not in a big 11+3, they can be charged as a youthful offender. And as we said, there are real consequences for them. There's a blending of the conversation here. Youth who are charged under raise the age per se, like Act 201, right? This problems with accountability for them is like they've signed themselves out of a residential program that DCF wants them to do, or it's they're not completing their education like DCF wants them to do. Of course, rightly so. Right.
And be engaging in the system that's supposed to
happen. But the consequences for that to not just to the youth, but to society are relatively low. That's the raise the age part. If we're talking about a felony and a violent crime and all of those things, I absolutely agree that accountability is important. But those tools are through the youthful offender and big 11+3, and we have no problem with that. I think the other thing about raise the age or this whole conversation is we're often talking about pre-adjudicated youth, right? And I know that was blazed past earlier, but that is an important point If you're talking about publicizing someone's picture and name in the newspaper, and to get back to the economic piece of it, right? Young people, it's already hard enough to get a job in 2020. Well, it may not be hard enough to get it may not be hard to get a job. It's hard to get a well-paying job, right? To afford groceries, to find a place to live, all of those basic things. And when, even if you have not been adjudicated as delinquent, if you're 18 or 19 and your picture and name is in the paper, that makes it all the harder, right? If if you're adjudicated, if you've committed a violent crime, I think that's a different conversation. But if we're talking about raise the age here, I just want to emphasize that that's an important piece of this, and that's why we have the law.
And that's where the where the person that is charged in criminal court, they may become youthful offender through a motion by the defense counsel or prosecutors or court, but it's already out there in public. So that's perhaps another reason that's a distinction between the two. Tom, I think that question.
Thank you. I agree with most of what everybody's saying. I really do. I believe in the brain science. For 100% of the people, no. I also agree with what Zach was saying, that there's just some people that aren't good people, no matter what their age is. And so, say if we raise the age, these youthful offenders are gonna, at some level, are gonna go through a judiciary process, I guess you could say. And was it Lauren? Yeah, Lauren pointed out, the wonderful things that can happen if they're in this system, which I believe. So they're in the judiciary system and you're going to that room. And that's where your help is. They go into that room. There's no DCF worker. We don't have a DCF worker to take care of them, to guide them. For the youthful offenders we have now, we don't have enough DCF workers. How are we gonna, what would end up happening is the youthful offenders, the age bracket we have now is going to get even less care because we're gonna have more people in the system. So who benefits by that with everybody getting less care? Yeah, if we can get the workforce in DCF up to snuff, I think that's the time that we start looking at a program like this, where up to the numbers that they need now, or even a little bit above what they need now to take on this extra work. I mean, we heard it from the horse's mouth.
Yeah,
They said, we can't do it.
I agree, but I would reframe that. I would ask you if there was a parent in this room and their child was there saying, I'm 17, or I'm 18, or I'm 19, and I can't, I'm working a job, but I can't find a place to live, and I got in trouble and I need this help, right? Say they're 17, right? We don't let parents just sort of be like, I'm stressed, I'm busy, right? If the kid's 12, no matter what age the kid is, right? I mean, if there's no legal consequences, maybe when the kid's 19 right now, right? But we don't do that. And for a lot of these kids, we're talking about they've been in DCF custody. DCF is actually their legal parent, right? We're also talking about DCF has, again, as we said in our testimony last week, this isn't just like an optional thing for DCF to create those services. There's sort of like there's a problem of DCF's own creation here, which is that there's not sufficient development of these supportive programs and services. And I would say that's not directly DCF's fault. In fact, largely it's not DCF's fault. It goes higher than that, right? But all of these issues we should be addressing head on. I completely agree with what you're saying in general, is that DCF needs resources to serve youth. Absolutely. But DCF can't just say we can't do it, and so therefore these youth are on their own and it's their fault. Let's do this stuff. Let's help DCF with the core of it. What they're saying about raise the age is largely, we can't even take on this small additional load, because again, we've said this again and again, there is really, when you start asking them about raise the age, what they start talking about is overall caseloads, their data system that doesn't work, the fact that we don't have enough money to develop programs. Sometimes they talk about not great legal representation, right? We heard about caseloads. That's absolutely something that we are concerned about. Training and workers' access to, to specialized services and training to work with this kind of youth. 16,000 calls a year, number one in the nation. The DCF, these aren't, they investigate and they find no maltreatment. They don't even look into them because they're fully screened out because they've identified there is not a child safety risk. That's a lot of calls for a small state. We're #1 in the nation. We've been #1 in the nation for, I think, 5 years in a row, both in calls to the child protection headline and in calls screened out. That's, to me, these are huge issues, right? Title 4E, our estimate is that we're leaving more than $2 million on the table every year, right? In federal money that we could be drawing down if we dove into that. So what's frustrating about this conversation is not your question, because I think I agree, like, I think we're all on the same team here, right? What's frustrating is that Raise the Age has become this sort of like lightning rod or this proxy for everything that's going wrong. And the more time we spend going round and round and round and moving backwards and forwards and, you know, carving out these little things that make the system more complex, the less time we're spending on the actual issues that are, I think, I wouldn't say more important, but that may have a bigger influence on the kinds of issues you heard about today, which, again, we absolutely agree with everything that DCF was saying. And you know, we sent a letter a year ago to the Joint Justice that basically says this exact same thing. I just was looking at it in February of 2024. I'll put it in our materials. So like this whole report, this is the Act 201 implementation report. They answered all of these issues 5-6 years ago, whenever this was written, November 1, 2019. So 4.5 years ago. And we're just sort of looping and looping and looping. And these are the things that we think we should work on. Thank you for your patience.
And some of the things that you said, I don't disagree with you. Again, but you made mention, and I took it as, how do we tell a parent that we're not going to be able to put their child into services, their youth into services?
No.
Like,
Sorry, I was maybe not the best analogy. What I was saying is DCF for many of these kids is or was the legal parent. DCF is their legal parent because they've been taken into DCF custody. Is what I'm saying. So the analogy was,
He's a plane.
maybe it wasn't the best metaphor. My overall point was that it's DCF's responsibility if the services don't exist to develop them. And if they're not developing them, like Barge you heard about, and you guys have expressed frustration with this before, you know, if they're saying there's not enough money in Barge and there aren't enough resources, then they at least need to be asking for them and have a plan for developing them. And what we see is sort of like just a want to shift things off their caseload, which again is one response to having
maybe I heard what I wanted to hear.
Don't we all?
I'll admit to that. But again, what's on my mind is if we put more youth into the system, the youth that are already into the system are going to get less of what they need, and they're already getting less than what they need and deserve now.
I think the goal would be not to have them be in the system at all, to divert them.
I don't disagree, but
So,
they're in the system and they aren't getting what they need now. And by putting more youth into the system, they're going to get less of what they need.
But I would say that
we need to get the resources up, whether it's the programs you're talking about. We need to get those up to speed. We need to get the workforce up to speed for what we have now. We don't have what we need now. And to add more, it doesn't make sense.
But then you're dealing with them in the adult system, I apologize. I'm not sure how that is.
I know,
Yeah.
but to me, it doesn't make sense to give less to the people who are in there now. And I don't disagree with anything that you're saying. But the key word is resources. I mean, resources is workforce, it's money, it's programs, and we're not there. So put more people into the system, unfortunately.
So the issue that I think is, and to you, Lauren, is we put the money to DOC or we put the money to DCF, it seems. I mean, those people are gonna have to be dealt with in some system.
Yes.
But they're still not getting the hires.
Right. Yeah, no, DOC is hurting really bad for.
DCF is.
Yeah, Lauren.
I think what has been most frustrating through this process, even as a former DCF worker, so I'll have their backs and I'll say maybe what they can't say, is really the lack of accountability that's on this administration to fully have a good faith effort to implement Raise the Age. That's what we haven't seen. And that's the accountability that I want to see. Really, they haven't asked for the positions to serve this population. They haven't asked for the money to create Barge, right? So
That's our job.
Yeah.
No, they
That's our job.
Well, also
It's both.
has to
It's
do
both.
some budget
Our
work,
level.
right?
It's
And
both.
so
Yeah.
Yeah, it's both, certainly. I mean, but we get the budget from the administration and we definitely
And then we-
add stuff as well.
and then we change it a lot.
Yeah, we change it a bit. Zach, then Ken, I think.
I think, I don't,
Okay,
I don't think Lauren got to finish her point. yet.
right.
you'll learn not to do that in the future. But go
I
ahead.
still stand by it.
And then Zach.
I do want to make sure Lauren was,
Oh. So you've got a pin on that you were gonna say as well, but go ahead. No, before.
No, I like the discussion. Let's
Okay,
keep
go
going.
ahead. Go ahead, Ken.
Maybe if we'd hold some accountability to some of these bad actions, maybe the brain would develop quicker.
If only.
Was that a question or wouldn't you agree?
It's a statement because that's all I'm doing is listening to us to a merry-go-round go around.
Right. It's a merry-go-round that we haven't stopped for 6 years. And
We're
I would like
enabling
us- I would like us to fully implement it and then do the wonderful work of evaluating it and see what's working, what needs to change. That's positive decision-making and policy-making. That's what I'm excited about.
I
and that's why
disagree.
we're
I
here.
think we're enabling it,
Enabling what?
this bad decisions
By,
by not holding any accountability. I already said that.
So accountability, we've got that as an issue. We have to definitely look for that. Yeah, Zach and then Barbara.
Yeah, and I think going off Ken's point on accountability, I think, and if you bring that back up, I'm just curious, just as a reference point, have you given any thought into what all these recommendations would cost the taxpayers of Vermont?
I will put it back up if you just give me one moment. I'm sorry to wrestle with this so much. Oh, no, that's not it. That's not it at all.
And I think,
Good thing.
and I think quite just if I could add on to that question, it's like, how much does it cost the taxpayers for us to do this in the DCF system versus the DOC system?
Well,
Because it's gonna have to be dealt with one.
Right,
or
and so I think, to clarify my point, Chair, I think it's just incremental, increase in budget to accommodate these recommendations.
So I will say, developing a user-centered new DCF system is a 50% federal match. And in our annual report for this year, which will be out at the end of this week, we have recommendations that say we have enough money already to do this system if we do it right. Already, it's about 15. We have about 7 point something state dollars, 7.8, which
And just
is the same
million.
$7.8 million. Thank you, which receives $7.8 million in federal match. We think that's enough to get to a place where the system is fundamentally redesigned and is much better. And if we do that, one of the things we've had to do is give back $2 million over the last 5 years, right? This is in the 2024 AHS System of Care report, because we were, it's kind of complicated, but it has to do with the federalism system. We were misidentifying who was eligible for federal funding. And so DCF had to give that money back. So, some of it is like the money we put in leverages more money. In terms of a price tag on some of this, I mean, the legal representation piece, that's where the $2 million is largely in savings is largely found. We already have the state match. So this is basically federal money to pay for legal representation in Chins matters. That's already happening. You guys already are allocating state money for it. So the state match is in place. We could be drawing down just as much federal money. That is, again, a circular problem that relates partly back to the data system. We heard earlier just, we don't have the data. I mean, so much of this is like, we don't have the data. And that's a circular problem that is, over time, there's less and less of an argument that it's not worth the money to do the data system. Some of the training, I mean, the last one is a statutory piece, right? I mean, I think it is not simple, but I think it doesn't cost like DCF millions of dollars, right? It costs time and energy and effort. I think it's a real problem the way our mandatory reporting system works. And I think a lot of other folks think this too, but I think there just hasn't been an effort to get together. Kin finding programs, that's a federal regulatory issue. So We've asked in our annual report DCF to fast track this, basically different licensing regulations, so that kin caregivers. So this is largely, it can be a child who's in the child welfare system, but also can have juvenile justice involvement. The child's not safe at home. How do we support kin? That has many meanings, right? Often a grandparent. How do we support them? How do we ensure that there aren't barriers to them becoming licensed, such as a charge from 30 years ago that's no longer relevant? So a lot of this stuff, to answer your question, doesn't cost a ton of money. And even if it does cost money, there's a lot of bang for the buck here. So these are the conversations we really want to be having. And I think these are the real way, not the real, these are ways I think that DCF could be supported much more than, even if raise the age for 19-year-olds is repealed. I honestly think that the problem here is that that's like the dog catching the car. And I just don't think it's going to solve these problems here at the beginning, which are these. The public wants to feel safe, right? There's frustration with shoplifting and other crimes. It feels like defendants are arrested again and again. Some definitely are. There's these stories about young people involved in violence. There's frustrations that 18 and 19-year-olds who reach the age of majority can sign themselves out of services. And then there's this last one that we just talked about. So my concern is that by passing these reforms, which again, we're opposed to, but even if they pass, my concern is this one really, we would have spent all this time and effort. And I just don't think it's going to address these issues, which are very real issues. So that's I think what's frustrating about this conversation. And I just want to add one more thing, because we heard something earlier that I thought was really damaging. And I wrote it down, but it's on my other, I don't want to stop sharing my screen. So that would be a problem. It was something like young people are more violent than they have been previously. And I think what the 20, 30, 50, 100-year data all shows is that is absolutely not true. You can say young people are dealing with different problems in 2024, and I think that's true, and that's a pandemic issue, it's a social media issue, it's depression. There is certainly youth victimization. There's certainly young people, who involved in the drug trade and guns. That is very concerning, but the numbers are so much smaller than they've ever been. We heard testimony on this the other day, right? And what, as you pointed out, Representative, is that, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, it just shows that young people are really struggling with largely internalized issues, right? And so that's why those community services are so important. But I think it's really, really dangerous on us to be saying young people are fundamentally different or more violent today. I think that is absolutely false. And I think it's a dangerous assumption that takes us back to, 30 years ago when the incarceration rates were off the charts for young people. And I think even, I think even the harshest proposal, which for raise the age, disagrees with the fact that we should return to that, 90s and early aughts level of incarceration, because it was definitely too much. So, Lauren, would you like to add something?
Can you send that study to Nate, so we can have it on our?
Sorry, which study?
The one you were just talking about as far as.
Oh, the rates of I almost put those in.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well,
I was just going to add, in December, the Nonpartisan Council on Criminal Justice further found that youth crime rates are declining. And what they are seeing, though, is that there was almost a superficially low rate during the pandemic. And so now when we see a bump up as we return to normal, it's coming into the public discourse that it's a giant teen crime wave when the data is not supporting that. And that what that is leading to is this national trend to roll back juvenile justice reform. And so I just want to caution us here in this room as well to not get on that bandwagon.
This is some data. This is Vermont data from the Vermont Intelligence Center. And there's two reports. One, it was Joint Justice who had Sergeant Lone, or now Captain Lone, testify a little over a year ago, I think, who was, I thought was a really useful witness. And Captain Lone talked about juveniles mirroring an increase in violent crime for adults, but at a slower rate. And here's one chart. This is from, so I'll also include, there was a report last year, and then I asked, I think they might have produced it partly because we asked them to, another one in 2024. Some of the numbers were the same and some had changed. This is one chart from the 2024 report. It only goes to 2022 because there wasn't new data available. But as you see, the green line and the sort of the two green lines, the sort of puke green and the more forest green one, those are, I'm sorry, I mixed that up. I apologize. The puke green line is the offender line for 20 to 29, right? Which has a sort of a spike from 2021 to 2022, right? But the one with the sharper increase is the victims from 10 to 19. And there's another chart, which I think I didn't include in this show, which we had in our testimony last week, that shows young people involved in gun and violent crimes. And it shows a similar pattern of there's an increase in all violent crime, but the victim line has the sharpest increase of all. The victims, the young people victim line. So it is true. And I think, that article there was an article in 7 Days about drug trafficking and some of the young people. There's Isaiah Rodriguez, who I mentioned, who, again, I hope some of you did your homework and read about Isaiah Rodriguez, but he's a really good example of this dichotomy between offender and victim. And, what this is saying is just that it's not always so clear, like who's a bad person and who. Sometimes the line gets really blurry. And what young people who are very vulnerable need is, among other things, is supportive services, right? And, these numbers, I don't have them here, but, when we're talking about youth involved with DCF across both child welfare and juvenile justice, we're talking about poor youth, and we're talking about disproportionately Black and brown youth. And there are some incredibly disproportionate numbers for youth incarceration, as we talked about last week. For Black and brown youth. But yeah, I touched on that nerve again, and I can tell you now we're back to that conversation.
But a point of clarification, because you just said that violent crime is not on the rise, and I think that's exactly what this chart is indicating.
So good question. Yes, good question.
I mean, point, right? Like it's.
So I think you're talking about questions of scale, right? So when I was talking earlier, I was talking about the 90s and the aughts, and I mean that, it's too bad I didn't put it in there. I almost did. The line has just like bottomed out, right? And now we're sort of in this little. Right. So it goes up and it goes down depending on certain things. But the trends are, like massively, massively down from 10, 20, 30 years ago. Yes, showing an uptick.
And another point of clarification too is maybe you insinuated this, but I just want to make sure that we have it on record. Are you seeing cases where youth on youth crime is increasing? Because that kind of seemed like what you were insinuating, is that a lot of the youth violence is against other youths.
I think that is some of it. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have data to show that?
That is a good question.
I'd love to see it, and we can.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I don't think we do. I think it gets back to some of the institutionalization points, right? Where a lot of the times, sometimes what happens in residential treatment and in, I don't think we've seen it in Red Clover yet, to my knowledge, but is things things can escalate both within an institution, and then also youth who leave there then sometimes engage in criminal behavior outside the facility, having met or sort of that decision having germinated in that facility. But I will look for that. I don't recall seeing that, and I think it would be interesting data to have for sure. Did you want to say something?
I'm going to send it to Nate, but the studies I mentioned show just the connection between increase in youth victimization. So it kind of speaks to that,
Sure.
But I'm not entirely sure what their conclusions were.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Barbara had a question. I think, did you have a question as well? Yeah, so Barbara, go ahead.
So I was surprised because one other pot of money that you didn't capture that Vermont returns is the JJDPA violation money.
Oh, thank you for reminding.
And so I forget how much we return, but I just want to make sure we're not.
So yeah,
What's the acronym stand?
The juvenile
justice and delinquency
prevention. It's the federal.
This is money that Vermont, it's not just that we return money, but our award for this year is reduced by 20%. This has to do with violations in incarcerating youth in adult facilities without either an interest of justice hearing or sight sound separated.
Or solitary, which, right?
That would sight sound separated. And I think, some would look at that and say, well, that's why we need a new facility. And I think that would be a mistake to draw that conclusion from that, because largely what that penalty, because it is a penalty, is that Vermont is misunderstanding federal rules and policies around detention of youth. And again, I'd refer you to our slideshow from last week, which is annoying, I know, because I don't have it here. But the feds have incentives built into the way they fund structures that incentivize states to keep youth out of locked facilities, all the way up to the point at which if a youth is, if we're drawing down 4E money because youth is in foster care and the juvenile justice system and they're placed in a locked facility, we can no longer draw down that money. We have also lost money for our residential care system because, again, there's federal incentives to keep youth out of those systems. So if our takeaway was we need more locked facilities because we got fined for these things, that would be fundamentally misunderstanding what's going on here, which is Vermont, as it continues to embrace more restrictive settings, we run further afoul of federal regulation that has monetary awards attached.
And I was trying to look at what are we spending for every young person that we send to DOC? And the best I could find was from 21, 134,000 a year, which seems like a lot of money given the recidivism rate, which I know we don't have the best handle on what that really means and how often those kids are returning. But we do know that kids tend to age out of crime, right? Mm-hmm. So whether or not we're holding them responsible, it looked like the research still holds pretty true that we.
Yeah, we had numbers last week from when Woodside was open. I was trying to pull up.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, what was the number from, sorry.
So it's gonna, so if we're not serving a 19-year-old in DOC, we're not transferring any of that cost over to, like with Raise the Age, we're not saying, we're gonna transfer some money from DOC over to DCF to help fund serving that young person, right?
That's a fight I might not want to step in, but
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there are some competing incentives here, right? I mean, I don't want to cast aspersions, but I do think that it's understandable that different entities within state government would like to have less responsibilities placed on them, right? We would like to have more responsibilities and more workers for us. But I found the number that I was mentioning. In 2020, Vermont was spending $528,000 to lock up each youth at Woodside. That's the Justice Policy Institute from 2020. $528,000. So, I wanted to get to that study if I could, that Loeffler study from earlier. But before I do,
clarification question before I'm going to go to Ian. But you,
yes,
I have a clarification from the conversation. Just go there.
Well, I just want to point out, it's like you need more people. DCF needs more people. Everybody needs more people. So it's not an idea of the money might be available. We don't have the people to enforce to go and take care of the situation. And again, I'm going to go right back. As long as we keep enabling bad habits, nobody's going to learn anything. I'm just going to use this analogy. I think I hate big words. When I was coaching, and I coached a long time in hockey or baseball or whatever, but I'm just going to stick to hockey. If I went and I chewed a kid out for doing something that I didn't like or stupid or whatever, uncalled for, just totally uncalled for. Huh?
No, I was real.
I said the kid. Okay. So, and if you want to know, I never got a penalty a bench penalty in my life, just for the record. So I am a little bit fired up right now. But anyway, my point of the matter is I could chew a kid out. And then it took me a little bit of time to realize I really wasn't making a difference in that kid's life, maybe a couple of years, because I'm a slow learner. The biggest thing I could do is when that kid went in the penalty box, and I coach men or coach girls, men, and women, was to go and take what they showed up for the most away from them, which was ice time. When they got done serving their 2-minute, 5-minute, 10-minute penalty, and I sat their butt on the bench for a period, or maybe a game, or maybe I suspended them a game or something like that, That kid came back with a much different attitude and learned from that. And I just want to point that out, that you can call that brain development, you can call that whatever you want, but there was a message sent and it was received. It was also known that that this coach cared for that kid and wanted him or her to develop accordingly and be accountable for their bad actions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, I can't tell whether, so should we be sort of directing questions to the? It's sort of like an opportunity for us to sort of think about this. I admit I am new, Mr. Chair, and I seem to have lost the understanding of like.
Thank you very much for pointing that out. I guess we have gotten a little informal here. So we are asking questions of our.
Okay, we are asking something.
Yes.
So I think the question I have would be, is there data, to Ken's point, that so we don't really know about 19-year-olds because they're currently in criminal court, but we could know about 18-year-olds because we raised the age from 17 to 18. So I'd be curious to see if you could provide the data to the committee now or at another time if there are more 18-year-olds offending in Vermont once we raise the age to 18 than when they were in criminal court before. Because I think that would be an interesting question that would speak to that.
Yes. Just a clarifying question.
Sure.
How might you measure that? Because by cases filed, or are you talking about?
Yeah. So okay. Yeah. I guess like I don't want to see if you mean by that question I had on Friday, or
I was just the question you just asked. Like, how would you want to see that measured? It's not a rhetorical question. Like, how would you want to see that measured? I think it's a great comparing 18-year-olds in the criminal.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, I don't know if I have the answer to that. My thought would be, I would be both curious to see if people are reoffending when they're still 18 or even 19. But I also would be curious to see if just more individual new dockets are filed with new people. Because the idea being, I think I've heard a narrative that like people learn, well, an 18-year-old doesn't like have the same criminal penalty as in other states, and so they come here to commit crimes or whatever. I'm just saying that.
I appreciate
so that argument would mean that there should be more 18-year-olds, new 18-year-olds offending as well with the change of raise the age. And I don't know, but the information
that is. Sorry, a good question.
So that's my first question. My second question is it true that the 7.8 million that you proposed that it would potentially cost to reinvest into DCF or raise the age, that at least some or all of that money would need to be reinvested into DCF to essentially support them to their testimony that they are under supported now?
I just want to clarify, the 7.8 was specifically allocated for the data system.
Just for the data system?
Yes.
Oh, boy. Oh, gosh.
data
Okay. So it's a lot. Because I think my question really is, and I appreciate my colleagues' questions from Zach about the cost to taxpayers, because everyone here knows that we were, given a pretty clear, from voters that tax burden is a real issue.
Yes.
And so I think what I am sort of curious about from your perspective is if we're trying to prevent reoffending and also trying to prevent pulling, as you testified to, having people become part of the criminal system. Is it true that a individual who is reoffending or in the criminal system further down the line, will that cost the taxpayer more money than what it would cost in reinvesting into DCF? And that's maybe a question you can't answer, but I'm just curious to your thoughts on that.
Yeah, one of our recommendations, if we get to them in our slideshow today, would be to broaden the conversation in terms of who is providing insight into this matter. And I think an economist who could speak to that would be helpful. If I knew of one, I would have. I do think that's a good question. And I think it's complicated. It has to do with how you measure it, et cetera. But I think that is the right question, is down the road, what is, the economic effects, as we're testifying to, of giving young people a chance to get on their feet, right, and not over criminalizing them early in their lives, right? There are certainly economic effects. How you measure them, I think, is challenging, and I think there are studies out there, but I'd have to.
Okay,
those are good questions.
So I'm going to do a time check. We have about 10 more minutes. And if you're unable to get through that, we can figure out another.
I mean, I would like to speak in terms of cost to taxpayers, there's going to be no higher cost than building a locked facility, right? That is 100% general funds, and that has no federal drawdown, that's no Medicaid funding available. So that is all falling on Vermont taxpayers. So if we want to be thoughtful and fiscally responsible, we have to develop alternatives, right?
And I would add to that, we don't have a price tag. I say it again. I don't think DCF has been straightforward with a price tag on what that's going to cost. And that's for the building part, right? And that's before we get to the operations cost is the number we said earlier. So sorry.
No, it's okay. I think another opportunity to leverage or draw down more federal funding is through fully implementing our Family First Prevention Services Act plan, which is approved by the feds. It's been challenging for multiple states to draw down federal funding through that system. But when I heard Nikki speaking about really getting motivation from the 18-year-olds and having that buy-in, motivational interviewing is the #1 intervention DCF chose to draw down federal funding for. And so that seems like a missed opportunity really to build the skill set of the workers to support them and give them more tools that could be offset with federal funding.
So thank you for the time check. We will take the time we have. I wanted to say a couple of things real quick. One, I wanted to get to this Loeffler study about recidivism. But first, I wanted to say that, this notion that drug dealers and/or young people who are dealing drugs are coming to Vermont because they know or think that they will not be held accountable, I think is predicated on a notion that these drug dealers who are using these young people to work for them care about what happens to these young people, right? The notion that an out-of-state Massachusetts trafficker of drugs would look at Vermont's laws and say, "Oh, we're getting tough on kids now. They might be, locked up for a longer time, so therefore I'm not going to da da da." It gets to your question about bad people. Like I think if you're relying on a young person who is, again, the percentages of young people who are in that position who have been trafficked is incredibly high. If that's what you're doing already, I just don't think that the Vermont legislature making the crimes more serious is going to have an impact on that. And I don't want to argue about that right now, but I'll just put that on the record. That there was a question about the way that Loeffler study defined recidivism. And I was trying to keep my mouth shut on the side, but I unsuccessfully. On page 7 of that study, which I haven't seen before today, they say that their definition is rearrangement. So recidivism is defined simply as rearrangement, which again is a pre-adjudication stance. And the folks who I know were originally on the docket for today, who are really the experts both on Raise the Age, who submitted this report in 2019, along with DCF and national experts, and who are also experts on the Massachusetts Raise the Age, is the Columbia Justice Lab folks. And so here's a statement from November 2023 that they released regarding that specific study that was mentioned earlier. Research shows that after Massachusetts raised the upper age of juvenile jurisdiction from the 17th to the 18th birthday, there has been a significant decline of all critical caseloads, arrests, arraignments, sentences, despite adding more youth to the juvenile system, and a decrease in recidivism rates for youth with prior charges. One study has shown slight increases in rearraignments for 17-year-old youth who had no prior involvement in the system, which indicates that the juvenile justice system may have had a net widening effect on those 17-year-olds by sweeping in too many low-level cases. The rollout of effective diversion programs across Massachusetts after the time period studied in the research report could already have addressed this issue, with positive results being reported by the Office of the Child Advocate. So that Office of the Child Advocate is the Massachusetts Office of the Child Advocate. They have a whole report here. I haven't looked at it, but I did include the link in our materials. So I just wanted to make sure that you all had that information as well. There's certainly, you can pick your studies in 2024 about what study says what. I think the OJJDP, as previously mentioned, the federal entity, and a lot of other studies have found that Raise the Age type efforts reduce recidivism in general. But your results may vary. So I just wanted to put that on the record. So, it might be time for us to close. I think we've all had a long day. I know I'm not sharing my slides right now. I'm just looking at them to see if there's anything worth sharing. I'll share this here and then we can sort of conclude and wrap up. Did you want to say something?
I'm still thinking about Representative Goslin. Did I say it right?
That's fine.
Yes, what the example you gave, and I appreciated it so much because you had that engagement with the youth and you knew what was valuable to them and responded accordingly, right? So you had that individualized case plan with that youth. And that's what I want to give the opportunity to DCF to do with the other youth. And so I think that is one response. And then also, I want to hear from the youth and I want the legislators to hear from the youth directly about how Raise the Age is or is not working or what is or is not working and use their expertise as well.
So that's the second bullet on here. I would encourage all of you, to the extent that you can set this up, to go to Red Clover, the Locke facility, and to talk with youth there. I would encourage you to talk with youth who have been in the juvenile justice system. I would encourage you to visit other facilities to the extent that that's possible. And because, there's a lot of talk about youth, and the nothing about us without us mantra, is a big one for us. The third bullet here, I really think we need to broaden the scope of experts we hear on this issue. I think we have a strong law enforcement and prosecutor presence in the room, and I respect that, and I think it's valuable to have, and I always appreciate, having my own thinking challenged. But I also think we need others here, including pediatricians, child psychologists, credible messengers who are folks who have been through these systems, and community providers who work with transition age youth, like Spectrum Youth and Family Services. They're doing a great job with this population. I spoke earlier today with Dr. Andrea Green, who's a pediatrician at the University of Vermont, who works with the New American population, and as well as is an expert with the American Academy of Pediatrics. And I think she has really valuable insight that this committee and anyone else on this issue might want to hear. She indicated her willingness to come and speak with you. Otherwise, I wouldn't say that. So I think our ask today, I think there's a lot of, it's been challenging to testify on this without actual legislation, right? To get to your point of like what we're doing here, right? There's going to be legislation proposed that we don't have. My understanding is there's a repeal of just the 19-year-old part of Raise the Age in that omnibus bill or whatever form it's going to take. And one ask we have is that you remove that piece of it from the bill. In other words, we can talk about youthful offender stuff. I don't know what is in that part of the bill either, but the ask would be that we remove Raise the Age, because I think what we're really talking about here is youthful offender and not Raise the Age, from my perspective. And then we already talked about this slide. So I think this is, I'll repeat some of this, but really address these DCF's resource issues. Not, when somebody makes a proposal about juvenile justice, but actually make that the core of the work. I mean, I understand you all are judiciary and you have a certain mandate, but I think that all of us need to make that the core and hear those things separately from this kind of highly charged debate about juvenile justice. So as always, I really appreciate everybody's time, energy, challenges, everybody. I think, this was a healthy conversation, and I appreciate the chance. Did you want to say anything? So feel free to reach out, and we'll try to submit 300 pages worth of studies to Nate for your reading pleasure. Just kidding. Just kidding.
The sources are all linked, so we have them at our fingertips.
You're welcome.
So lots of material for us to read if we want to dig even deeper, as I'm sure we all do. So thank you very much for testimony.
Thank you all.
Appreciate it and appreciate the information. And tomorrow we'll continue this conversation with additional witnesses in the morning. Just so folks, I sent out an email that has the ask of for the BAA, the Budget Adjustment Act. If you get a chance to just take a look at that at some point in the morning, hopefully I'll have 10 minutes to discuss that a little bit and perhaps take a straw poll on where we are with that. If you have questions in the